Ready?
Cool. Okay, so thanks for your patience, everyone. This week we'll be talking about more one-on-one concepts within the bottom-up training framework, if that's how you want to understand it. This, I have to admit, is maybe the least interesting concept for me, which is like general preparation and accessories. And I think the reason why it's the least interesting is that I think the idea of general preparation is almost antithetical to the idea of bottom up development, because one of the key pillars of how I've implemented building training for athletes for the last 7 years is understanding where they are, like what's the individual's current like fitness level, where do they want to go with that fitness level, and then what do they need to develop, and viewing exercises as like general preparation, and or like accessory movements. It's hard for me to view an exercise that I'm putting into the program as a GPP exercise or it's just accessory, because typically I try to justify every exercise as either a primary. So we have like special preparatory exercises, then we have special development exercises, specific development exercises, and then we have GPP, and I think the last one is just based off of whoops, did I make mess? What happened? How did I do that? The hell? That's weird. I don't know what I just did. Oh, there. I made myself full screen on accident. The GPP idea is like one of the last concepts in Bondarchuk's framework. Anatoly Bondarchuk is a throws coach. He wrote this book, Champion School, Year-to-Year Model for Developing Elite Athletes. It's where the emerging strategies framework was developed primarily, and it's one way to implement a bottom-up framework. So you have the competitive exercise, which is the primary exercise. Then you have a specific development exercise, which is pretty much a movement or an exercise that emphasizes certain parts of the competition exercise movement, and maintains the energy system of the competition exercise. So typically it's in very similar rep ranges, and is training, like in this post, it mentions the physiological systems that are found in this specific event. So something like a specific preparatory exercise as well is not going to emulate the movement, but it will probably train the same muscles, but it may train different energy systems. And the difficult part of this is like understanding when does an exercise become an SPE and an SDE. I've actually made a post about this on my Instagram. It's actually kind of difficult to really differentiate them in the context of powerlifting, because we're just using a barbell. So like when we're using a barbell, the competition exercise is a single out of 7, 8, 9, 10 on the squat, bench, and deadlift. And then the SDEs are just different like tempos, or maybe we add a pin or some small deviation from the main exercise. But in Bondarchuk's scenario, they're using more dynamic movements where, you would use like a stand throw versus I don't really know how they do those exercises, but they're more dynamic, a lot more rotational energy, etc. So you're not able to train the same movement. It's a lot easier to get away from the main movement. Whereas with squatting, benching, and deadlifting, it's not like you're eliminating much of the main exercise or deviating much from the primary exercise. So then when we get to something like a specific preparatory exercise, that's typically where we're training, a specific muscle group that needs development to help the overall underlying body of the competition exercise. So for bench press, maybe you find an exercise that only targets the triceps. That could be emphasized as an SPE. Then like the general preparatory exercise, and this is, like I said, like the least important one, or not important. It's like maybe exciting because they mentioned that it's an exercise that does not imitate the competitive event and does not train their specific systems. Generally speaking, these exercises are very all-purpose and used for general coordination and recovery. So, like, in the context, are you leaving? Okay, I'll see you tomorrow. Good luck. Okay, 1 second. Have fun. Okay. These exercises can be kind of anything. I mean, technically, you could say that like a dumbbell overhead press is a GPP exercise, because it's not like training the specific energy system of the competition squat or bench or deadlift, but you are training a muscle group that is utilized in the squat, bench, and deadlift. So anyway, I just think that that's important to be aware of when we talk about GPP and accessories, because we have to decide that, an exercise is, we have time for, we also have desire to train, and then to some level we feel it's going to benefit us overall. So it's also going to be sport dependent, because a dumbbell overhead press might be completely general physical preparation for a thrower, but in the context of powerlifting, I think it would be difficult to dichotomize something like a dumbbell overhead press from an SPP or an SPE or a general preparatory exercise. So with all that to say, I still think that there are exercises that are probably useful in the context of powerlifting that could help overall benefit the athlete in a way that is not specific to even using a barbell or a dumbbell. There is some evidence that cardiovascular training can be really useful for developing and increasing work capacity. I'm making a post right now, and I'm not mentioning it on this slide, I'm just pointing this out, but I did a post about cardiovascular training for powerlifters, and while doing that, I was doing some research on cycling, like high intensity and moderate intensity cycling training, and the impacts that it might have on strength over time. And one of the things that they noticed, or that they implicated, was that once the individual adapts to like moderate to high intensity, moderate to low to moderate volume or duration, and cycling or just like cardiovascular training, individuals typically improve their work capacity, and they use the word muscular capillarization, which I think, well, I know what it is. I don't know if that's how I said it properly, but it's increasing the amount of oxygen that the muscles can receive during exercise, which oxygen, despite not being used as much maybe for one repetition, for doing anything above like 2 or 3 repetitions, oxygen becomes a important variable for how much volume you can tolerate in your training. So I think that cardiovascular training may be one of the most effective forms of general preparation exercise for powerlifters specifically. Because if you're a powerlifter, what are you usually limited by? You're either limited by your total muscle mass, you're limited by your ability to like recover from training, because it can be fairly fatiguing and, I would just say fairly fatiguing, stressful. And a lot of my athletes that I've worked with in the past as well typically mention that they get just like general aches and pains from sitting all the time, for example. I know a lot of powerlifters also have desk jobs, and doing something where you're able to move the body and move the hips in ways that are more dynamic than something like a squat, bench, or deadlift may be beneficial for their general preparation. And I think that's kind of how I like to think about GPP is like more in that category versus like this is a GPP exercise, and more so what activities can we be doing throughout our day that may mentally and physically prepare us better for the training that we're going to be doing that's dedicated to powerlifting like we have in our development block. So like during a development block, I might not recommend like, hey, we're going to do lat pull downs for general preparation. Like I don't necessarily think that there's no utility to lat pull downs other than like, yeah, generally speaking, doing a lat pull down is like good for your health or something like that. I think having bigger lats can be really useful in improving your bench press specifically. And so I'd probably categorize something like that as a specific preparatory exercise versus a general preparatory exercise. Something like a sled drag, for example, I would categorize as a general preparatory exercise because, well, it's very different from the competition movements. You're not doing the same energy systems, similar depending on the distance. And I would also say that high intensity interval training is very similar to, or even could be equated to like resistance training with a barbell. For example, if you're doing like 5 sets of 15 all effort sprints on a bike, it's pretty similar to 5 sets of 15 repetitions, or maybe even 5 sets of 10 repetitions, like on a barbell or a dumbbell movement, especially if you're performing them all to maximum contraction and minimizing like rest between reps. So the other thing is to consider how GPP could actually interfere or be counterproductive for your competition movements. Because doing too much GPP might not only get psychologically dull when the benefit is kind of psychological novelty, i.e. doing things that are just different from your normal exercise. Because I think as powerlifters, we definitely identify with the squat, bench, and deadlift variations and anything that's going to help those movements specifically. And so I think it's hard to visualize like, well, what would be the benefit of doing like 45 minutes of cardio? I think our bodies are really good at adapting to any stimulus that we give it, as long as we're careful of giving it too much, like giving too much of our stimulus to our body. So if you're not used to doing any cardio, for example, and you decide that you're going to add 7 days of cardiovascular training at various intensities and frequencies and volumes, or intensities and volumes, then you may notice an acute reduction in your force production, especially if you are doing something like running, which has been shown to more specifically reduce force outcomes and strength adaptations compared to something like cycling. My hypothesis for that is that it's probably difficult for people to minimize their intensity on a run. I mean, like technically you can jog, but there's also probably a lot more impact on the muscles when you're like jumping from step to step versus a long, brisk walk, where you have a lot more control over where you're placing the force on your feet. You're still maintaining control over the like muscle contraction from each stride. Whereas when you're running, at least my own anecdote would say that my body feels a lot worse after a run than after a long walk. My personal recommendation for most powerlifters is to get around 20 to 30 minutes of walking or low intensity exercise at least 3 times per week, and maybe even more. But I would start with 3 times a week. And then we get into things like, rep ranges, total percent of weekly training, development block versus pivot block. I'll go into those in a second, but I'm just kind of cutting to the main part of this presentation, which is what I think you should do for GPP. And I think something like walking or cycling for 20 to 40 minutes multiple times a week, 3 to 5 times a week, if you're adapted and you have the time to do it, could be really helpful. But if you want to completely reduce the potential for it to negatively impact your training in the short term, something like a 15 to 20 minute walk before your training sessions, anecdotally, it's not only for myself, but my athletes, seems to help psychologically and physically prepare lifters for the training that is about to come, that day. So I like doing the cardiovascular training on the same day as the training, typically before. And the reason is because if you work in a job where you're just sitting down all the time, it might be useful to walk, get your body, like create kind of this psychological barrier and also physical barrier to like break through before you actually start high intensity squat, bench, and deadlifting. This is something that I've communicated with my athletes, but I think it's difficult to truly get into a flow state if you jump from like a high stress job or like all of your daily responsibilities immediately into strength training without some like barrier. This is what I noticed with lifters who train at home primarily, and then they go to a gym. They notice that they have improved like strength for at least for a brief period of time. I've noticed that myself as well, and I think the reason is because of that like shift and environment can help provide for a little bit of a break between what you've been doing all day if you work at home, or if you work at your office and you maybe have like a gym in the office at some building. I don't know how the corporate world works, but I don't think anyone in here does work in the corporate like office lifestyle. But even still, having some of a barrier between those two emphases of your life, or like categories of your life, is probably useful. And then cardio adds another psychological barrier, or even like, I don't know how to, maybe like a box to put yourself in, so then you can have like you're in your work mode, your cardio mode, and then it's time to train, versus work mode to train mode. Additionally, low intensity walking is like so low impact, and the total time is also very low, that getting a nice like sweat can help warm up the body, and you can start visualizing and like literally mentally preparing for the session. So a lot of times I'll encourage my athletes to think about the session that they have coming up while they're doing the cardio. Think about what their technique needs to feel like. Think about the top weight that they're aiming for. And it can be very meditative. One of the main benefits of cardio psychologically is that once you get in the flow with it, it's a very meditative experience. Ideally you're not like distracted on your phone the whole time you're doing the cardio. And you can just kind of be with your thoughts, your feelings, and your emotions that may have been suppressed while you are working all day, and might be continued to be suppressed when you go to train. So again, if GPP is preparing us for training, that is one style that I highly, highly recommend. Now let's get into some of these like concepts about rep ranges, percent of weekly training, development block versus pivot block. So I was intending to talk about like general exercises, but again, when I'm writing a development block, I'm not usually thinking as much about general exercises, but I do want to present options for athletes. So for example, if someone is interested in developing their shoulders and it doesn't necessarily directly benefit their bench press or their squat or the deadlift, then something like an overhead press, I would say, is or could be a GPP exercise. You are training the same muscles, or at least similar muscles as in a bench press, probably not the shoulders though, but you're training your triceps. I think intent matters a lot, and the correlation between exercises. So like if you're noticing an interference effect, then it probably is no longer GPP. It's probably, more of an specific preparatory exercise. So like if when you do overhead pressing, your triceps get really sore, you don't notice a benefit on your bench press, but it actually negatively impacts your bench press, then maybe the exercise is actually being performed too intently, like the RPE is too high, the total volume is too high, and And the psychological arousal might also be too high for that exercise. So intent matters in that. If you go into the exercise like, I'm just having fun with this, I don't really care what happens. Getting like 3 to 4 sets of 10 to 15 or whatever on an overhead press probably won't be a big deal because you're not putting too much into it. But if you're bringing a lot of focus and intention with an overhead press, then we kind of have to assume it's going to have some overlap on the other pressing movements that are in your program. So again, that's why I don't like thinking about most barbell and dumbbell exercises as GPP. What about rowing or like curls or like lat pull downs? Well, similarly, I think that if you do a row, you'll probably benefit in some form through the stability increases that you get by strengthening the scapula, the rear delts, the mid traps, the lats. Those are all going to play a role in your squat, bench, and deadlifts because, for example, on your squat, if you have a bigger back, you typically have a bit more comfort in putting the bar like on your scapula, for example. I find skinnier athletes have a really tough time finding a comfortable place to put the bar, especially if they're low bar squatters. So that's like one very ancillary benefit of performing a row. Additionally, rowing and like lat pull downs and things develop very strong like rear delt musculature, which is very useful in maintaining scapular stabilization throughout the bench press. If you've heard me talk about bench press before and the form checks, you notice that I really encourage like pull the shoulders down instead of like pull them back. A lot of people think about scapular retraction, but I found that scapular depression as an emphasis is probably more useful because pinching your shoulder blades together is only going to limit the ability for you to fully produce force into the bar. It also increases the range of motion unnecessarily by kind of like pulling your shoulders back. It just limits how much force you can produce in the bar because you're also introducing instability in that case. So like a row wouldn't necessarily be a GPP either because I think there's a very specific reason to perform that, though it is not technically in the same range of motion as any of your competition movements. You're not actually training any of the same muscles that your like primary force, their primary drivers are not your lats or your rear delts on any of those exercises. But they are a supporting role. So I think you could categorize them as GPP. Again, it doesn't really matter how you categorize it when you're thinking about development blocks though, because when you're creating a development block or thinking about a development block, all that matters is that every exercise in your program has a point. There's a focus of it. There's a utility that you can measure, whether subjectively or objectively. When I do rows, I feel really good. When I do curls, it makes me excited to go to the gym. Like if we took those out of your block, then maybe you're not excited to go to the gym anymore because no more bicep training. So then what about pivot blocks? Well, I think with a pivot block, you can explore different types of exercises and different types of cardiovascular training as well. One of my suggestions during pivot blocks is to allow the lifter to explore something like a new sport. What I mean by that is maybe you have an interest in basketball that you have been neglecting because during your development block training, you didn't want to, have a negative impact on your powerlifting training by trying out something like basketball a few times a week. So during your pivot block, that's another opportunity for you to try something new, give you an opportunity to kind of, socialize with people in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. Maybe you want to go like snowboarding, and you want to have time for yourself, like out in nature. I think those are really important things to make sure we implement during your training career, because a lot of times I've worked with athletes where they almost neglect so many different aspects of their life because, hey, I'm training for powerlifting and I don't want to get hurt. And then they become very fragile in the sense because they're almost scared of doing other types of activity. What I mean by that is out of the gym activity, snowboarding, basketball, football, any sport that, is just a novel experience for you. And I think that's another way I think of GPP is like, really, what does general physical preparation mean? I think it means, one, it helps us with the sport, but then like it also helps us to stay healthy mentally and physically. And so by exposing yourself to a wide variety of movement patterns, we can prevent ourselves from getting, too negative with like how we view training and how we view other types of training as well. Now, it's not like you have to do like CrossFit or something if you never want to do CrossFit. But if in the back of your mind, you've always been kind of excited to perform a new type of sport, this is where implementing some GPP during your pivot could be a useful and minimally, or there'd be a minimal negative impact on your primary emphasis, which would be, at least in this case, powerlifting. So what if you don't care necessarily like the specific, whether like a row or a curl or something is either an SPP or a GPP exercise, and you've already got your cardio in, that's locked in, and you're doing that, low intensity. Again, I kind of suggest lower to moderate intensity cardio. For most powerlifters, I find it to be easiest to secure. I find it to be minimally impacting your performance in powerlifting. And I also recommend doing it before training because I find it to be low. It's like a low psychological impact too. Like you don't really stress out to go walk for 10 minutes, but you might stress out after like if you did your squat, bench, and deadlift already for your day, and now you got to walk on the treadmill for 15 minutes, but you got to go home and cook dinner and get with the kids. I find that people typically skip the cardio because they're actually tired and, they're going to do some movement, some non-exercise activity after the gym anyway, so they just skip it. So that's why I recommend doing it before, as long as it's lower intensity and relatively low volume. So let's assume you're implementing that. How should we, what types of like GPP exercises could we implement? What protocols could we implement for exercises that are like barbell, dumbbell, cable, that wouldn't, require as much psychological thought? Because I think that's another thing is if you reduce the you don't want it to match your competition squat, for example, in terms of your intent. I don't think that's very useful if you're going to call it a GPP exercise. You can treat it very, very seriously, but then I think it's probably going to, it's not really general at that point. It's probably more specific because you're bringing a lot of intent to it and it's a significant stressor. So the different types of protocols that I find really useful for GPP exercises are density training, myo reps. Total time is like kind of like for cardio. Just do something for this much time. I don't really care. You can also do like circuit training as well. I'll get more specific with each one of these. And then RPE focus. So it's kind of like session RPE, but for the exercise, you'll kind of set an RPE for the lifter and a certain amount of sets, but then they can select their own rep range. So let's get into each one specifically. So with density training, one way to implement density training would be to set the intensity, so to cap the intensity and then perform enough reps at that intensity for a certain amount of time. So for example, you can have a lifter work up to, let's say, a 12 rep max on a row or a curl or like a overhead press, I guess, are the ones that are in my mind, or a lat pull down or a rear delt fly, also a nice one. Face pulls are another one that a lot of people do. I don't know. You kind of have to get creative on your own, but typically those are going to be your posterior chain exercises for like your upper back, or your biceps, or core. Core is another one to emphasize, like planking and ab wheels and things like that are really nice exercises that you're probably not going to implement during your development block. Or if you do, psychologically, they're typically not going to match any of the other exercises that you do. So like a front plank, side plank, Bird dogs are nice for GPP. Again, just training slightly new movement patterns in that way could help you to become a bit more prepared for the other exercises, though I don't like to attach something like a front plank or a bird dog or any core work to like, if you don't do these, you won't be prepared. But if you perform them, you might feel a little bit more prepared because you're still going to train the intra-abdominal wall on all three of the primary competition exercises. But core work can be fun, and it may be beneficial for some lifters that maybe not have great awareness of the core. If you find that you struggle with bracing, if you find you struggle with like your breathing mechanic, then adding core work can be really nice. If you just want to increase your erectus abdominis, then doing some crunching can be nice. But again, that's not going to directly impact your squat, bench, or deadlift. So I think you could categorize it as GPP because, hey, having a strong core probably has utility in life. I don't really know what it is, but yeah, you can add that. So anyway, density training, doing something like a 12 rep max and then performing that for, as many reps as possible for 8 to 15 minutes. Obviously, the volume there is going to impact the overall fatigue. So I'd start with a lower time amount for density training when you start. And the other thing is you're not going to perform that rep maximum. You're going to select a load that would be that rep maximum. So if you implement a 12 RM load, that would be like a set of 8 at 6 or a set of 10 at 8, right? So you can do a set of 10 at 8. I wouldn't recommend doing any sets above RPE 8 for density training, simply because of fatigue associated with higher RPE sessions, especially at higher rep ranges, are going to produce a lot more peripheral fatigue, and then you're probably going to negatively impact training at some point. So most GPP training should be done below RPE 8, and if it's a rep range focused exercise, then you want to do sets below, probably below 8, to be honest, because of for a similar reason, and I'll talk about that in the discussion more. And then we have myo reps. So if you've never performed myo reps before, they can be kind of confusing, but I'll just verbalize how you perform them right now. So you select a top set rep range. Typically, and this goes against what I just said, but typically that's going to be something like a set of 8 to 15 at an RPE 9. And then you will perform a drop set rep range, which could be like sets of 3, 4, 5, or you could do another version of myo reps where you just keep ramping up to RPE 8 until your rep ranges drop below a certain threshold. So let me write out an example. So one example could be like by 12 at 9, then by 4 at 10. So in this concept, or in this way of implementing a myo rep, you're working up to a 12 at 9, and then this arrow means like rest pause basically. So you'll rest for like 5 full breaths. So that's going to be a full inhale and exhale like this. So you'll have that full rest, 5 breaths, and then you perform sets of 4 with the same weight until after that rest pause, that set of 4 becomes an RPE 10. Another way to do it is you aim for a 12 at an 8, and then, or even like at a 7, and then perform sets of at 7 with the same load until our reps drop below, 5 or something. And you'd make sure that you have 5 breaths in between those, or some arbitrary time limit in between those sets. Okay, does that make sense? And then we have total time. So that would be like perform I don't know, let's just say root out flies for 10 minutes. I think I'm gonna probably combine these two at keep each set at 7. So in this case, you would adjust the load, keep RPE at 7 for each set, and then stop once timer is done. Okay. So those are some ideas that I have in terms of like protocol suggestions for GPP. Of course, you can just do like straight sets or something. That's probably fine. You know, but these are ones that I find like psychologically to feel different from what we're usually doing. So I just like to try to categorize things and then be consistent with that categorization. But again, you know, you're trying to get the lifter to have the best response. So I've been talking for 40 minutes now. What do you guys think? And then I'll talk about some more things with the seminar that I listened to today.
So I'm not sure if my connection's good, but I think for accessories, the protocol that I like the most, just double progression, like where you, it's just like easy and fun. Like you don't have to think too much about what weight to pick, just like something in the right neighborhood, and then try to beat your records over time.
Yeah, I think that's actually probably a good one that I miss is double progression. Because yeah, like you said, you can kind of, so if you guys don't know, double progression would be like 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps. Like start at, well, if you have an RPE goal, that'd be like at 8. Start with sets of 8 at 8, and then you know, each week add 1 rep as long as RPE is maintained, you know, or you don't have to think too much. You just like add a rep, right? And as long as you're not failing, you did a good job. How you implement that, I think, is probably, you know, lifter dependent. But is that kind of how you implement it? Like once? So once.
Mine is even like looser than that. Like I might do something like 6 to 10 at 6 to 8, or like 3 sets of 6 to 10 and 6 to 8. So it's like just stop. You feel like stopping if you're in the RPE range, and but I actually kind of do believe in bringing a lot of intent to these, contrary to what you were saying earlier. Just, I don't know, I guess that's almost like a life philosophy that I want to put maximum attention on all the things I'm doing, but I'm not sure. I've read some stuff about how even on low RPE sets that you want to go for max concentric force output. But I haven't really looked at the research for this.
Yeah, so I think with accessory movements, I kind of forgot about that portion of the presentation, to be honest. I think like if you have like an accessory movement and like you know, hey, you want to build like muscle or something, then yeah, I do think you need to bring intent. But like if it's for like quote unquote general health and you don't necessarily categorize hypertrophy in that, like for example, if you're doing like, I don't even know how many examples I have for this, but for example, I don't think you need to bring a lot of intent to low intensity cardio. In fact, I'd try to reduce the intent to a degree where you almost forget that you're doing cardio, because then you can be more meditative and be more like, you get the real benefit of cardio in that sense, because your heart's doing its thing because you're moving, but you know, you don't need to be like thinking, all right, 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, you know, you don't need to be like marching. But yeah, I think with something like any of the exercises that you're like barbell, dumbbell, cable exercises, I do think you should bring intent. Actually, it's just because those exercises are like a row, it's not probably going to interfere as much with a, you know, comp squat. But if you're like bringing the same amount of arousal to like your cable row as you do to like your comp squat, the only thing to be aware of is how does that impact your total stress, I guess. So I don't think that you shouldn't bring intent at all. It's just that you want to be aware of the intent that you're bringing And if you notice that is like the arousal that you bring yourself towards the end of your session is like somehow impacting your future sessions, like on your main lifts, then they become less like supplemental and more interfering. I mean, mostly because of how the individual psychological like flexibility can play into their total training session. Like I like to have the session kind of be categorized by the psychological intensity that's required. So like a dumbbell curl, even if I bring max intent to a dumbbell curl, it's not gonna, maybe I'm contradicting myself, and I probably am, but I suppose like even if you wanted to bring the same level of intensity to your dumbbell curl as your comp squat, like I don't even think you really can, because you're not, I don't know. I don't think you can fake out yourself that hard that you're about to do like sets of 15 on a dumbbell curl compared to like, hey, I'm about to do a triple on my squat, and if I don't do this, I'm going to fall over and die. You know, like I just think it's difficult.
I think that the absolute load of the lift, and whether it's also probably if it's loading your spine, probably affects how much it's psychologically fatiguing, I guess is how I would think of it. But I would just say I think that maybe it's just the way it was worded was throwing me off a little bit. Yeah,
you're probably right. So I'm just gonna make an adjustment to this so that anyone watching amendum. I don't know those words. Adjustment. I'm just gonna write adjustment. Bring intent, but be aware of the psychological stress and how that may impact future like following sessions, and then like I guess you just have to do what you can with that information. Like if it doesn't impact you at all, then bring as much intent as you need, because I think you're definitely right. Bringing intent to most, I mean, you want to be there present, and then also like you do want to maximally contract as much as you can, you know, voluntarily for all these exercises too, if you want to get, you know, the most hypertrophy out of them. You don't want to check out, you know, on your rows, because it probably won't be that helpful either. So yeah, I think I just misspoke on that.
When I do like
go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say, when I do, you know, different accessories like that, I always think about doing them in the least athletic way possible. You know, just like a machine doing a contraction, controlled and slowed, and it's very like a bodybuilder type mentality. But I never really thought about it as you know, preserving or using it as fatigue management, just more as potential hypertrophy gains out of it.
Yeah, I think that's probably more what I was describing. Is like, yeah, you know, contract your bicep hard, but like, I don't know if you need to be like, come on, you know, like get the cable to your chest. Like, and I know bodybuilders sometimes will do that too, but then they're like, they just kind of go nuts. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think personally, I'm not going to want to do it if it means that I got to get that hyped up. Like, I think the intent kind of builds over time with any of these exercises. You know, like a row or a fly or curl or an extension or something. Like the intent kind of builds as they get more familiar or like in the zone, I guess. But I'm not like, I don't like ever think I would need like caffeine, you know, to have a really good cable row session. You know what I mean? I think that's kind of in alignment with what I'm trying to describe.
There was just the Stronger by Science podcast, I think this week, where they did a meta-analysis of basically the mind-muscle connection. Did you do this?
Oh, no, I thought you were going to go somewhere else with it. Go ahead, though. So
they were saying that actually the mind-muscle connection hasn't really been shown in literature. So they were just suggesting, even on bodybuilding stuff, just max, just move the weight basically. I mean, don't do something stupid like using your entire body for curls, but
yeah.
Like even the literature doesn't really support these super controlled or mind muscle stuff.
That's interesting.
I'm kind of just like, I find it fun to just do powerlifting for everything. I mean,
yeah.
Like, you know, like that video I showed you before about the way arm wrestlers train biceps. It's like, makes me question everything ever about mind muscle connection, because they're just literally max effort 1 RM bicep curls, and they're like gigantic.
They have, Richard, I think you forgot, or you didn't see that. It was a few weeks ago, but we were watching some bicep curlers. They're big, like big biceps. And, and they do like 1 rep max that you mentioned. So yeah, you know what? I'm okay with I think as long as you're happy with the thing, my take is I don't think you're going to have a negative impact focusing on mind muscle connection. Like, you might not maximize the growth, but if your perception of RPE is what the goal is, and you do it frequently enough, my assumption is that you're going to have some effective growth, you know? Though you very likely will get more out of it with more intent and more like excitement, you know, in those exercises. But then I think that's why, I don't know. This is why I said GPP exercise. I think that the word GPP bums me out a little bit, because it makes me feel like it's not for me, but like for the general health of like humanity. Because it should be for the individual. But when people talk about like GPP, it's like, well, everyone should do this, everyone should do that, so everyone should probably do that. But like, there's probably a lot of things that I should be doing that I'm not doing, and I think I want athletes to feel like they have ownership over it a little bit more. And so I'd rather not call it GPP. Like when I write someone like a row, you know, I want to get specific with it. I want to tell them, like, you know, I think a single arm dumbbell row would be really nice for you. Like, you seem to benefit from more scapular retraction, like in your squat, for example. It'd be, you know, get some big lats on you, you know, like I have a reason for it more specifically. And so we talked about this a little bit last week, like the development block and pivot block stuff. I think there's reasons to have those exercises in your training like all the time. And if you have a specific reason and you can attach it to the competition lift, then I don't know, the idea of GPP kind of dilutes the intention of the exercise for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I also, to be honest, I'm really skeptical that GPP, like cardio and stuff, helps that much, because I actually think I have way more cardio than most of the powerlifters I've seen, but they can handle a lot more training volume than I can without getting tired, because there's a huge difference between moving just your body weight and even moving like 50% of your max. Like, they're completely different energy systems and everything. So I was wondering about stuff like blood flow restriction training and barbell complexes and stuff, where the energy systems might be a little more similar. I mean, I think for general health, cardio is great, but I've never noticed that help my work capacity.
So, I mean, obviously it depends on how you're defining cardiovascular training, because obviously you can keep pushing cardiovascular training to a further degree with something like your body weight and, you know, a bicycle or walking or running, than you probably would prefer in any of the competition movements. But like a barbell complex, I think, would be very similar in that way. So I want to talk about that for a second. Like, there is a lot of evidence to indicate that like powerlifting training at, you know, if you're doing sets of like 8 to 20, even maybe a little bit under that, you're still going to demand some level of aerobic like your aerobic energy systems in a very, if not identical way as you would with like a jog. It's just that you wouldn't depend on it for that long, but it is. I have to look at some of the studies, but there is some evidence to indicate that they're very similar energy systems, but you're just not training them for that long. So the overall impact is going to be different, but you know, it's still there. Like aerobic capacity is still important for work capacity. Now the fatigue that you're mentioning, I think, is probably more related to the okay, so this is where the Beardsley seminar probably comes in, and then we can get back to like BFR training. So, because I actually did a podcast with Dr. Buckner, who did like his whole thing was he studied BFR training in powerlifters and bodybuilders, and out of Dr. Lenecke's lab in Alabama, I think. But anyway, the Beardsley seminar that we just listened to, like right before this call, he was talking about, you know, he's one of the guys that talked about like effective reps. I think it was just like a thing that he was a proponent of. Like there's a certain rep range that is effective for muscle growth, basically. And there's a limit, and then there's also going to be a threshold where if you passed it, there's likely an increased fatigue associated with it. So in the seminar, he presents that he is a huge proponent of sets of 5 to 8 reps at or below RPE 8. And he doesn't like to go above that for most athletes because the cost of fatigue. So if you want to get the effective reps out of like a set of 15, you need to do at least 10 reps. And then, or like, I mean, there's going to be some effective, but there's a pretty diminished return until you get to sets of 10. And then 11, 12, 13, it's going to be pretty high on the effectiveness for like hypertrophy. However, there's a high level, I think he said like calcium ionization or something like that. Basically the peripheral fatigue starts to increase almost exponentially in the like 10 to 20 rep range at higher RPEs. And so he is a huge proponent of like multiple sets of 5 to 8 at or below RPE 8 to minimize that physical fatigue that you might experience after one of those training sessions. And the other thing he mentioned is that high fatigue training can limit force production on subsequent training sessions. And so, like, if your goal is strength and hypertrophy, it's probably effective to stay within that rep range for like the benefits of muscle growth, but then also so you can continue to train throughout the week without like high levels of DOMS, which isn't necessarily fatigue, but DOMS is one version of that. And then like peripheral fatigue in general can reduce the maximum force output, the maximum voluntary force output in the muscles that you're training. So I guess what I'm trying to say is physical or peripheral fatigue in the muscle cell probably is a big contributor to like negative strength outcomes. And so something like a barbell complex, in order to get any effective reps, if you're trying for like hypertrophy, would be pretty high. And the fatigue associated with that, I think, would also be pretty high. Especially because typically when people do barbell complexes, there's only a few movements where they could do like a lot of reps in, like typically the rowing and the hinging. People can do a lot of reps, but the overhead pressing, the overhead pressing, if you did like an overhead press in the complex, it probably would avoid, because the fatigue probably would increase a lot sooner on something like an overhead press versus, you know, basically an unweighted, 45-pound hip hinge or a row. So I've found that people enjoy them, but I also don't know if there's going to be more of a benefit to a barbell complex in comparison with something like 10 to 15 minutes of cardio, like low intensity cardio. And the reason I say that is, at least anecdotally, for myself and athletes, I find total step count to be really effective in reducing like the lower body, at least like lower body hip aches and pains. Again, I think it's primarily because of the meditative aspect of the cardiovascular training, and because like low intensity walking is typically not fatiguing at all. I mean, I don't know. It depends if you have like weighted carries, but I'm not a huge fan of barbell complexes from that perspective. But if they're fun and the lifter enjoys them, then I think there's benefit there. It's same thing for like sets of, 10, 8 to 15 or 8 to 20. It might be, you might sacrifice some peripheral fatigue, but because there's novelty with the exercise and that rep range, that might allow the lifter to want to keep training, and sustain their training for long term. So I think that we have to be okay with letting go and having some sacrifice. But I think your question is more about how do we actually improve work capacity, or at least that's kind of the implied question. And I think that to some degree, increasing muscular capillarization is probably a big driver there. There's a study that I will pull up to. I should have it up. Cardio. So this is like a meta-analysis, I believe, from 2018. Right? I think that's what that is. Oh no, this is a meta-analysis, this one. One second. This one's from 2012. But their intent was to investigate which components of endurance training are detrimental to resistance training outcomes. It took 21 studies with a total effect size of 422. They had to do strength training alone compared with strength training plus endurance training, or to compare combinations of concurrent training. The outcome measures include at least one measure of strength, power, or hypertrophy, and the data necessary to calculate the effect size must be included or available. What type of training? So I think the overall conclusion was that the interference effect, which is what we're kind of discussing, of the endurance training are primarily a factor of the modality, frequency, and duration. So volume, intensity, and volume, frequency, and then the type of exercise that you perform. There's potential negative impact on power, strength, and hypertrophy if you have a lot of cardio training and a long period of time doing the cardio training. Again, that's kind of why I like the walking, for example, because the intensity is low, the modality isn't impacting people for the most part. But one of the interesting things from this study in 2018 was that when combining either high intensity interval training or sprint interval training, which is nuts to me, but you can do. I think they had some people do this on a bike as well. They found that when you implementing high intensity or sprint intensity training with cycling, there's almost no negative effects from doing that. And they also implied that there might be the same metabolic adaptations as resistance training. And then, wait, where's this? There's another one that I think. Maybe this is the next one. So there was a study, and I don't know where it is anymore, that was implying that adding cardiovascular training might even have a positive adaptation for work capacity when combined with strength training. But overall, I mean, I can find the study later and post it in the group, but I think that if you're going to implement like a general preparatory type cardiovascular training, you still need to approach it like another training variable. And you wouldn't want to just like throw in 5 days of cardiovascular training on to you. And then you mentioned specifically that, you know, there are other powerlifters that have like a greater, or they don't get as fatigued from a lot of like certain styles of training. And I think that that's, I mean, there's so many reasons for that to be a thing. It could be because they are younger or something, you know, they're younger, their actual work capacity is pretty high just because maybe they come directly from a sport. And so the relative intensity, relative frequency and volume from like their previous sport could be a lot lower. What I mean by that is powerlifting doesn't demand a lot from them, but they're used to a lot more on their body. It could be because the protocols that they're implementing are lower, like average stress accumulation per set, similar to what I'm describing with Beardsley seminar, the Beardsley seminar, where like maybe a lot of their volume is lower RPE, and they never kind of pass that threshold where intraset fatigue is really high and peripheral fatigue is you know, they're able to minimize the peripheral fatigue. And maybe they're also able to minimize the central fatigue as well. So I think in terms of like, how do we improve your work capacity? That might be more of the question of what types of like training are the most fatiguing for you. And then can we get more work in without continuously crossing that threshold where you start noticing the negative impacts?
Well, this could get really specific for me, I guess, but like I've done other sports like grappling, where I would say the cardio demands of that are really, really high compared to basically, you know, 5 to 10 minute rounds of cardio, whole body over and over again in a single session. But if I do kind of a high RPE set, even RPE 8 or something, I tend to have lots of fatigue and my performance starts to drop off, especially if the reps are higher. And, you know, I think other people who don't really have an athletic background, they don't seem to fatigue as fast from the lifting. I feel like it's really specific to the sport somehow, but I don't know really why, if it's from the central fatigue or something else.
Well, I think that goes back to what we talked about last week, or even in the discussion on the Discord about like there are seemingly a lot of people that are just describe similar things to what you're describing. I would even say that I'm one of those people. I think the threshold for everyone is going to be slightly different because, you know, even in Beardsley's study, like surely not every individual has like this RP8 threshold where their peripheral fatigue is too high once they do sets of 10. Like I imagine we have enough biological differences from individual to individual where there's going to be a different threshold for everyone. But then the psychological fatigue as well, kind of going back to like what limits our voluntary force contraction. I think that the psychological periodization of sorts could explain some of that, or could be one reason for like high RP training not being as effective for you. And I would even say for me too, and I'm really enjoying my training a lot more, at least with not ever going above RP8 on any of my compound movements, and having the majority of my work being below RP8 actually, which is new for me. And I find that I also really struggle with work capacity. But again, I think the big thing is like, how much am I adding and how quickly? And then the other thing is like, I don't know if work capacity is necessarily defined by like fatigue or like, I mean, it could be, I guess, but it's like how much work can you perform over a certain amount of time without wanting to quit? And I guess that is fatigue, but like it's a certain type of fatigue. your ability to produce force in the next session isn't necessarily a consequence of you having a low work capacity, I don't think. I think it might simply be due to the specific peripheral fatigue that's associated with the intensity at which you're performing a certain like volume protocol, i.e. the RPE of a certain protocol might be more related. But if you were to reduce the RPE, could you get more sets in? And then would other people perceive that to mean you have higher work capacity? You know, like, could you do more work basically at lower intensities? And then now all of a sudden you have high work capacity. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe Robert has something to say because I've been talking a lot.
Robert, what's your take on this?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I have nothing intelligent to say.
How does your estimated 1 rep max drop off depending on, like, let's say you do a set of 8 at a 9 or a 10 or whatever, you notice like a big drop off in your next set even after resting, or is it kind of just a small drop off?
It depends. It can, there's times where I manage to really squeak out a really strong set, even if it's like a single that I don't know, maybe you psych yourself out for it and manage to do it. And then it just, I plummet after that, you know? Like I've done like SPD single days and it's like, oh, I managed to pull a really strong squat out of my ass. And then suddenly my bench is just, even my bench, which is not like directly related, is lower than, or at least down to where it was just during a regular training day almost, you know, just because the central fatigue ends up being so high from such a max effort.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is like something to really lean into when it comes to like periodizing your own training. And this is why I think training structure is really important as well, because again, how we organize the individual session can greatly impact our ability to, you know, perform on that day. And whether that means that on game day or whatever you don't perform, I think if you're noticing that type of fatigue drop off, and it's impacting other exercises or the rest of your session for that exercise, you know, it might not be a protocol that's as valuable as another protocol that gets you, you know, you still get to bring that intensity and the intention, but you don't go past that threshold where like, man, I don't want to be here anymore. Or like, I don't want to do my back off work that I could have otherwise done, you know, if I just kept it at RP 6, for example. I've noticed this myself with this like higher volume training that I'm doing. I'm, like I said before, I'm doing like a triple out and 8 and then 3 to 4 sets of 7 at 70% of the estimated max from the day. And especially when I'm not consistent with the training, the first 2 sets of 7 are hard, but they're fine. I'm like, man, I'm tired. I am sweating. I'm like breathing. I know I have another set. I know I can do it. I do the third set of 7, especially how my training has gone the last few weeks where I just miss a lot of training. I do that third set of 7 and it's like, man, I don't want to do my leg press now. I don't want to bench anymore. Like there's just like, it literally feels like there's this wave of energy that just like leaves my body after the third set. And I think that is the consequence of that is pretty aggressive. If like me doing one more set means I don't want to do my other sets on the other exercises, when if I stop that set short, I just cut that set out completely and I went on to my leg press and my leg extensions or whatever, and I was able to maintain the intensity and the energy that I required for like good, effective training with those different exercises, like maybe the net benefit would be higher. And so I think kind of what you're describing, I wonder if leaning into that more, or having, for example, more programs in the community that benefit, you know, people like us, I guess, where our fatigue just cranks up like crazy. Cause Jeff, do you notice that too? Like if you have a certain RPE top set that like you need to back off a bunch on your back off work,
So I actually have I've stopped doing back off sets because I don't feel this. I would rather do ramp up sets because psychologically it's really easy for me to get into that. And I mean, I just like if I do 3 ramp up sets, I don't know how much it helps me to do 1 or 2 more back off sets, and they always feel really hard. I almost feel like it would be better to do a ramp up on a new exercise because it gives you kind of a break to do the warm ups again and hit some low RPE sets. And psychologically, it seems easier. So I've been thinking about restructuring my program like that. I've also thought about doing some really low fatigue protocols that are almost like a density protocol where maybe you do like, let's say a set of 5 at 7, and then you say, okay, I just want to keep all my sets at 7 or less, and I'm going to do X total reps. And then it's like, even if you feel kind of tired, you're like, well, I'll just do 2 reps. I mean, it's not going to be that bad. And just kind of get some volume that way. Because from what I've seen in the literature recently, even really low RPE sets are good for both hypertrophy and strength, as long as, I mean, I usually go by like at least a 10 rep max for most of my, not for the accessories, but for the main stuff. And I don't know, I could definitely experiment with that and maybe write a program. Because like if I look at the RTS programs, for example, I'm like, how does anyone even do this? It's like 7, 8, 9, drop to like an 8 and do like 3 more sets or something. I'm like, are all of these people mutants? Like, I just don't even get it. I can't even complete 1 training session like that.
I was one of those people that thought that way. I was like, man, you want someone to do a single out of 8, a 4 out of 9, and then 3 back off sets for sets of 4? I mean, like, I guess you can do it, but a single out of 8, then a 4 out of 9, that on its own, psychologically, is really fatiguing. And obviously you can, develop you can work with it differently. You could just do that top set. I think there's still utility in having back off work if you need it, but I think, and this is kind of why I like the base strength program that I have on the app, because it's very minimal, and you can kind of use something like that to decide if, do you really need more work? Because one of my favorite things to do with athletes that work with me, well, I won't do it just to do it, but if I'm noticing that they're talking about like, I'm fatigued, I don't really want to be in the gym, like I'm just kind of like sick of this, before they work with me, ideally. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you doing? And it's like, well, I have 8 sets of 5 on my squat 3 times a week. And, like it's something similar for the bench press and the deadlift. It's like, well, how much do you think you really benefit from all those sets? Because I think when it comes to strength outcomes, being mentally ready for the session and physically and psychologically excited for the session probably has more of an impact on what they're capable of than the total volume that's being accrued during a session. That's like, it kind of goes back to intent. Like, if you just go to the thing and do 8 sets of 5 at 70%, that's so much. That's a lot. I mean, it might not look like a lot because the average intensity is low, but if you're really bringing intent to every exercise and the lifter is describing that they're not feeling good, I take everything back to like, what if we did like 2 sets of 5, and we increase the intensity a little bit? And do
you think they're actually like you think you could actually like mess up your technique that way? Because if you just do endless sets, even if it's a low intensity or something, I feel like, I don't know, maybe people can bring more focus than I could, but I just can't focus on having perfect technique for that long, I guess.
I mean, I don't know if they'd like mess up their technique, but I think they would definitely need a period of their training where they, if not, I mean, obviously I prefer having, I like having some top set, like an anchor set for that reason. where I have to work on my technique, or otherwise the RPE will be higher. But if you're not doing that for the majority of your training, I probably would recommend a period of, block of training where there is an anchor set or there is a top set at a higher intensity, to dial in the technique. But then like I also obviously I like something like 2 count pause deadlifts for a deadlift, or a tempo squat for a squat, for another load limiting way to focus on technique without it being super psychologically fatiguing. So I do think that if your technique breakdown is high during those sets, then probably you don't need all of the sets. Or I'd rather them do like a leg press. That's the other thing. Like if you're just doing a competition squat, I'm not really sure I understand why you need to do all your volume on the squat itself, when you could do something that's a lot less psychologically taxing, like a leg press, or a split squat, or a close stance squat, or something, like a plat squat, where you don't need as much load. You can challenge the muscles that you care about, but you don't need to be worried about your upper back positioning the whole entire set. I think that's kind of where it's similar to what you said. It's like maybe your technique would be messed up, but also more so why. That's like, I just think it's unnecessary. The benefit you're getting from more sets of squatting is pretty marginal at some point. So maybe there's an exercise where you don't need to worry about these small things that do matter, like for the squat, upper back tension, and like bar position, and like the bar sliding on your back for 8 sets of 5, I imagine would become a problem. And then you just introduce random like sources of error that I don't think are necessary. So you won't ever see me writing 8 sets of 5 for an athlete unless they specifically are like, I don't want to do anything else than a squat, bench, and deadlift.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I almost want to, I mean, there must be a reason that this kind of thing is out there. So I guess it's, a lot of people are having success with it. It's just strange because for a while I was like, why can't I do anything? Like, I just can't follow all these programs that are out there. But I think maybe it's just something about my psychological makeup that's, I can focus on powerlifting for a short time, but not just like an hour of comp squats.
Yeah. I would say I'm pretty much like, I want to show you my training from last year. It's pretty much it's similar in that nature where I'm doing as little as I needed to, because I would just get, I don't know if it's fatigued or bored or what, but I just didn't want to do any more work. And I never understood the justification for like, if that's where I'm at in my training, like, I don't know if doing more of the thing I don't want to do is going to be helpful, even if it like some physiological benefit is there.
So is this like the Equator program and some of the like nomadic powerlifting? Because I like the programs for the most part, except the frequency I feel like is too low for me. But I like some of the ideas in those.
Yeah, I think I was running both Equator and nomadic powerlifting. I guess I'll just pull those up, but well, I'll just go to me and I'll show you 1 second, and I'll see, because I think I ran nomadic powerlifting leading into my competition. Equator is like a really low frequency because it's a half frequency program with low frequency, like, so half frequency and bottom up is just like you're doing the competition lifts every other week. So like your competition lifts are already low frequency in terms of how often you're performing like a squat. But let me get to, when was that? Like May 2021. I've increased it significantly as of late because I don't know. I think I just get excited. I'm much more psychologically prepared for like heavy lifting and a lot of lifting than I used to be. But yeah, like this was my training like was like 2 months out from competition. Work up to a triple out of 7, triple out of 8, triple out of 9 on squat, and then bench press, same thing, and then I move on. This was a refresh. Maybe this is a little pivot that I did. I think this is a pivot that I did. Was it? No, this was a full block that I did. I just did triples at 9 on the squat and bench, then triple out and 8 on the deadlift. And I think I was doing it maybe I didn't record it. I wasn't as good at recording back then. That's unfortunate. Then my May was like the block leading up to the competition. So I started introducing a little bit more volume. I did like a double at a 6, double out an 8, and then 2 sets of 5. And I responded pretty well to that. If I go to my exercise history back then. So that block where I was just doing triples actually didn't work very well. But once I gave myself a bit more volume, not necessarily volume, but just like I needed a little bit more. So if you see here, I was doing doubles at 5 on this session. Double at 6, double at 8, and then 2 sets of 5 at 7. And that bumped me back up from kind of the downward trend that this caused me. And then, I was able to hover around 210 squat, but I really enjoyed it. And like, I actually hit all-time PR on this session at like, 82 kilos. I think my best set was, I thought I hit like 205 in competition, and maybe I didn't. But yeah, I guess at 195 for a double. And then my competition was on the 21st, and I hit 210 for a single out of 10. So, I had a very similar, like, I didn't not do back offs, but I made sure that my top set arousal wasn't so high that I couldn't do the back offs. And I think that's a really important variable to consider, because now I'm doing kind of something similar, but I'm just shifting the rep ranges a bit with the triples and 7s. Kind of going back to like, okay, I usually get super fatigued on my back off. So what can I do to ensure that my energy level will be high enough, so I can get to the work? This is like easy weight on the bar, but I've tried 75%. That's pretty hard. I've tried 80%. I'm like, I don't even want to touch that. I don't like doing back off, like even a 5% load drop for the same repetition, I think is kind of too demanding for me. And I like getting a lot of like easy work in after a very psychologically taxing top set as well. So, I don't know if that's helpful, but basically I definitely agree with you. And I've had very similar like experiences with minimal training. And if I actually go to, I think I took Equator 237 off of the store. I might not have. Oh, no, I didn't. So this particular program is pretty low frequency, but it's kind of similar in that protocol I just described, where you have the competition squat and then leg press in one day, and then you bench on the second workout, and then you deadlift on the third. I guess this one's a 4-day version. So then you have 2 bench sessions. You bench every day, but then you only have lower body twice a week. I found that really nice because I find that I can only get excited for lower body training, or at least at that time period that I wrote this, like once or twice a week. Now I kind of can do it a bit more, but I just have prepared myself a bit better. And then same thing on the second block. But the thing is, week 2 is the secondary exercise. So I thought I would like this approach, but I'd rather have done a competition squat with a different rep range than a secondary movement. Because this is typically too load limiting for me, where I never felt like super prepared for the competition squat the following week. So I would have probably if I make this version or something like this, I would have had competition movements every week, but then just change the rep ranges instead of switching them to SDEs. Though this isn't horrible, I think some people can respond really well to this. I have lifters that run something very similar to this, but it wasn't really for me. I didn't run it for very long. I only ran it. I did this for like 3 months actually. I just didn't want to do it again. I was like, I want to keep pushing my main lift every week and beat it, versus this is a lot more like extended.
I mean, what if you just ran the first week of this? My main thing is I'm actually like superstitious about squatting twice a week. Like if I'm not squatting twice a week, I feel like I'm not lifting. Maybe I would be fine once a week, but I've just, in my entire career, I've never squatted less than twice a week. I used to squat 3 times a week.
I was superstitious in the other way because I was worried I was going to have like hip pain that was recurring. And so anytime I had like an extra squat session, I felt my hip more than normal. And it was just a maturity thing, but I decided to give it a full block and see what happened. And I only did that back in January, where I added a second squat again. I can't believe it's April 30th. It's crazy. But yeah, I was in the opposite direction. So that's where this program was developed. But I think it'd be really easy even to have, a squat movement after this session. In fact, not that many people run this program, so I could easily add that if something like this is useful. Because I think if you're used to 2x, I don't know if we have to take it away.
I also think, the benching in this is actually more than I can handle probably, especially the first week. The INOL is like 4
yeah,
or more. And I've done like something like 2.7 to 3. So I think it's like 33% more, but yeah, I should, because the gym I'm at now, I really don't like the bar for squatting. So it kind of discouraged me from wanting to do low reps. So I've actually been using just the base templates and kind of messing around with them until I go back to Hungary.
How long will you be in Serbia?
I'll be here until June 16th.
Right.
But I have my final exam on Monday also. So I'm kind of in a transition period where I'm not super focused on lifting the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think that combined with equipment that isn't enjoyable makes it hard to, I don't know. So I think it's harder to know what is okay to do. But I almost find that in those scenarios, like shifting some of the volume to like supplemental exercises can be nice. I mean, it's not ideal, but or high reps is fine as well. But if they have like a decent leg press, which I think they do, the leg press that you have at your gym is really.
They actually have the goat leg press. They also have a safety squat bar, which I think I'm gonna maybe try that because I don't think that's gonna bend so much.
Oh yeah, those things are stiff. Like they don't move.
I don't know why they don't. They have a safety squat bar, but they don't have just a single decent barbell. Like it's just CrossFit.
Oh, is it a CrossFit gym?
I don't know if anyone does CrossFit, but I just hate the bars and the plates they have at CrossFit gyms.
Yeah,
it just drives me nuts.
And they never have center knurlings.
Yeah, I could live with for higher reps, but the bend in the bar, it changes the the 1 rep max like a lot.
Yeah,
I kind of feel like I'm being a coward because if you watch like some of Eddie Hall's lifts where he's just lifting at a random gym and like bench pressing 600 pounds for reps on some crazy CrossFit bar, like I feel like I'm being a special snowflake or something. I have to have a powerlifting bar to lift.
I am also a special snowflake, and I think that I'm justified in it. I mean, maybe I'm not, but I think that there is a risk factor that maybe Eddie doesn't give a shit about with having low, not ideal equipment. I mean, obviously, if you're noticing that there's a difference in your technique, I mean, it causes somewhat of I don't know if it's a fear response, but like, hey, there's a risk here that you weren't otherwise exposed to. And I think that makes an impact on how you set up your training. If you're Eddie Hall, I don't think you give 8 shits about, whether or not you get injured. Like that dude did.
Have you ever seen that video, by the way? It's crazy. No spotter, lift off 600-pound bench for reps on just a random gym bar.
Yeah, I saw your video the other day. That bar is pretty wobbly.
It's terrible.
Is it this one, by the way?
Yeah, it's that one. Yeah, the 265.
Oh, dude, this is like the bar that you have. This almost looks like this almost looks like a deadlift bar. What the hell? This is so wide. Dude, that thing is whipping.
No spotter.
These kids are just like,
no
damn,
spotter.
Dude, you're crazy. Like close grip too. Damn, dude, he's got some mass.
I feel like this is one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. This is just shows the difference between me and Eddie Hall, I guess.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I just think that some people's risk tolerances are different, and every time I've ever ignored myself, I do something dumb. Like, I don't know if that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but like when I really ignore like those types of things, I mean, I think you can ignore them and then adjust for it. But if you were like, no, it doesn't matter, I'm just going to lift the same weight as normal. I mean, you could prove yourself wrong, but what's the cost? I mean, like, if you know you're not going to have it for that long, why not just make adjustments while you can? And then when you get a better equipment, you can reap the benefit. It's like when I trained at home for the whole winter. Like, I was really nervous about my squat rack, and it did develop like this kind of, I don't want to squat in here because the rack isn't stapled to the floor, and the ramp, there's like a ramp on the platform, so it's like kind of elevated. And I noticed that, and like my anxiety would always really impact. It would minimize. Like, I would be like, I don't want to hit a certain weight, and I think it was like 405 was like the weight I just didn't want to hit, and so that kind of impacted me. And then I started getting medicated for my anxiety. And I stopped thinking about it, and that really helped. And then I did break some barriers, but like I also adjusted my technique a lot, and I started getting used to the deviation and used to the fact that I have to now bend forward. But I didn't do it immediately. It was like, it took me like a month or two before I was really comfortable with the adjustments I was making. And I still have a great bar, and I have great weights, and I had a good squat rack. So I was able to offset the thing that was in my brain that was preventing me from lifting that, breaking that barrier, by justifying all the other things that are benefiting me and having some medication to minimize those intrusive thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, there might also be some stuff going on with like people who become extremely strong are probably very risk seeking, like not to mention they're probably taking like heavy androgens and stuff, which can change your psychology for this kind of thing.
Definitely Eddie Hall. Yeah.
I mean, even going back to the what's the first, Pat Casey? Is that the first guy who benched 600? I mean, he's got some insane feats of strength, and he would like do like dips with hundreds of pounds by candlelight in a shed and like all kinds of crazy stuff. So like, I just think these guys are built different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is why I've been talking so much about like psychological components of strength training, because it's literally ignorant to think that doesn't have an impact on how someone performs. I mean, if we know that the environment makes a difference, then how does the environment impact our psychology? And then like, why do some people thrive in certain environments and other people don't? You could just say, oh, physiological differences, but I just don't think it's that simple, because, there's so much more to maximizing your like genetic expression or whatever, like, than simply physiology. And so I don't know. I like to lean into my biases when I have no reason not to. especially if the risk isn't really like if the risk feels high to counter my intuition, then I will not counter my intuition. If the risk is low and I just want to explore new stuff, then fine. But I mean, I would say that equipment being suboptimal is one reason to like modify the training for the equipment, then like try to figure out how to modify yourself. Unless like you have a competition coming up and then you have to modify something about, you know, maybe you do need to like mentally amp up or, you know, get a bar grip shirt or something, you know what I mean? But if there's not like a consequence, we already know that changing training to like, there's so many different ways to get strong. So if you can find a different way to keep you training and enjoying your training and the movements that you care about, then it's probably better to do that than to like force your single out of an 8 or something with like mediocre equipment, you know?
By the way, this photo is what I'm talking about with them doing lifts on like ridiculous equipment. Like, imagine doing a 600-pound bench press off of this.
Yeah. No pins, no safeties. It's like, I don't even know what this is.
That's the uprights.
I mean, like I do, but like, it's such a different experience. I imagine pressing out of that.
The plates actually look nice.
The plates do. Those look like those nice, like, they don't use them as much in competition, but I really loved those silver lining Ivanko competition plates. I don't know if you've seen those, but those are so sexy. Like they're like chrome rimmed Ivanko competition plates.
Yeah, those were probably some competition Olympic plates or something he was using.
Last thing before I go, we're going to be building a few more programs. And one program I want to build is going to be based off of like the Hepburn method or like style of training. Not necessarily because I want to do it, but because Chris Beardsley was emphasizing that he thinks it's a really good way to like kind of combine a minimalistic approach to training, minimize the fatigue, and then like maximize the hypertrophy that you can accrue during a strength focused like powerlifting block, I guess. I don't know if this is a good website, but I'm just saying that that's another concept that we're going to add to the community. And then if you guys are happy with the programs right now, you know, I'll keep letting you guys know when we have new stuff. Robert, how are you guys doing with training now that we're over with the presentation?
Yeah, I've